Good evening, my fellow citizens. I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. 18 years ago, the event of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world, as well as the war. Since that time, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth. But over the years, the number and the yield of weapons tested have rapidly increased, and so have the radioactive hazards from such testing. The number of children and grandchildren with cancer in their bones, with leukemia in their blood, or with poison in their lungs might seem statistically small to some in comparison with natural health hazards. But this is not a natural health hazard, and it is not a statistical issue. The loss of even one human life, or the malformation of even one baby, who may be born long after all of us have gone, should be of concern to us all.
After the first Gulf War, thousands of American soldiers returned from Iraq complaining of a variety of troubling symptoms that collectively came to be known as Gulf War syndrome.
What is causing these problems? Well, we only know that it's called Gulf War syndrome and that it's more complicated than what the mainstream press is reporting.
The Pentagon refused our interview requests and also refused to answer our written questions.
Within a couple of days of getting there, everybody was sick. We had nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sometimes all at the same time. Sometimes, some people threw up, some people had diarrhea. Everybody in this one, it was like 90% of my unit.
Originally, my symptoms was respiratory distress, diarrhea, and unsteadiness. But as a female vet, I did not want to go to sick call and look weaker, which is a stigma in the military.
I came down with severe body pains all throughout my body, and it was like a severe case of the flu. And I'd never had anything like that in my life. And I'd always been in excellent health prior to that.
I got out of the service in 2003 with the multiple problems. I was a type 2 diabetic. I also had high blood pressure.
My legs were getting infections. The skin on my feet and in my toes, they were cracking and bleeding. Basically, now I feel tired all the time, and I don't sleep.
My tongue and my gums split, and they started bleeding real bad, but the sergeant that was next to me had no effects at all. And it was almost instantaneous.
Fatigue, rashes, itching. I was really actually healthy before I went, and I just had a recent physical.
I started having a lot of panic attacks. I lost a lot of weight, blood pressure. I got nervous when I got around people, got real shaky.
I'm tired all the time. My joints hurt. I've had bowel problems, you name it, thyroid, on and off thyroid problems, memory problems.
People were actually getting worse. I had to give some of my men time off and told them just go somewhere and get your act together. They were falling apart.
I started to have all kinds of weird problems, and they can't seem to give me a direct answer on what my problem is.
For more than a decade, the official position from the White House and from its so-called blue ribbon panels, and from other congressional hearings, was that Gulf War syndrome is nothing more than post-traumatic stress disorder, a form of depression. People, they believe, were just not happy being over there. They didn't like the fact they were in this battle to begin with, and hence it resulted in emotional conflict. So they came back and ended up with these wide range of symptoms. Well, we have some questions because now there are dozens of scientific studies that show that what they were exposed to in the Gulf theater is actually what is causing what is known as Gulf War syndrome. Let's get to the truth. Why are they suffering, and what can we do to help them?
The Gulf War veterans were, without a doubt, exposed to biological and chemical weapons, radiation weapons, the vaccines. Our troops were exposed in no uncertain terms, have come back with the symptoms of those exposures, but yet have been denied treatment.
Well, with American troops once again fighting in the Gulf now, health experts are trying to get to the bottom of this puzzling illness and keep it from happening again.
Whether or not you supported the first or second Gulf Wars, that is not the issue. What is the issue is that very brave American soldiers went over there to do their duty and to fight. Over half have come back sick or are now sick, and the government is denying any responsibility to help them.
The Pentagon says it simply isn't true, but the Pentagon refused our interview requests and also refused to answer our written questions. So all we can do is cite a statement from early this year that the Department of Defense physicians have found no clinical evidence for a unique illness.
Who's involved in the cover-up?
I served in the first Gulf War and then went on later in the last 3 years of my career to serve in the office of the Secretary of Defense, working in the department that was researching and putting out information on Gulf War illnesses. The department from the beginning embarked on a public relations campaign to confound and confuse scientists, veterans, Congress, and the public at large. There was actually a battle plan, a document that was the guiding principle for this public relations effort, and it was called Bronze Anvil. Bronze Anvil is a public relations campaign designed to confuse scientists, to change the focus, to make everyone think that veterans were ill because of stress. And the first thing they did was they called it Gulf War syndrome.
Our top story tonight concerns Gulf War syndrome, a sickness affecting thousands of Gulf War veterans that is yet to be explained by medical experts.
And that's confusing to scientists because a syndrome is a set of diagnosed problems that leads to a disease process. And that is not what has happened to Gulf War veterans. But initially, just that word alone, Gulf War syndrome, made it invalid in many scientists' mind that there was a real problem. The Office of the Special Assistant for Gulf War Illnesses hired public relations specialists to craft this policy and use it to conduct its outreach. And some of the things they did was they would hold town hall meetings in such a way, knowing that the veterans were angry and knowing that the veterans didn't have real answers yet from the government, they would hold these meetings in such a way to overload them with information to make them feel as if the government was really looking.
And I've occasionally been asked whether the U.S. government agencies that deal with problems like Gulf War illness have been honest about the causes. And I have to say that no, they have not been completely honest and candid. about the multiple causes of Gulf War illness.
We have reason to believe that some of these illnesses may be the result of exposure to chemical and biological agents in that region. This contamination could have occurred in several ways, either through direct exposure from chemical or mixed agent weapons, or from the fallout as Allied forces bombed Iraqi chemical and biological weapons plants, throwing hazardous debris up into the weather fronts, which continuously moved down over our troops.
Deputy Defense Secretary John White told the Presidential Advisory Committee on Gulf War-related illnesses that U.S. troops destroyed Iraqi rockets, which contained nerve agents.
Were biological weapons used by Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War? The Pentagon won't tell, but some veterans say otherwise.
We were led to believe that our soldiers in the first Gulf conflict were not exposed to biological weapons by Iraq. What is the truth? Is it possible that many of those weapons of mass destruction, the chemical and biological agents, actually caused Gulf War syndrome?
I was exposed to daily mortar and rocket attacks. When the helicopters flew over the base, the Apaches and the Cobras, there was a stench that blew up from the sand, and we never figured out what it was. But I got a bunch of sores from that on my skin, my feet, for months on end.
One of the jobs I was given one day was asked to take my native divers and dive upon a Scud missile that had just dropped down into the port. I refused to put my divers on site because of the fish that I saw floating around in the bay. I studied marine biology in the University of California and decided that it wasn't from percussion that these fish were dying from, nor was it from the fuel that was in the rocket. I had determined that I felt it was a chemical agent.
As we see, most of our patients now admitted these days is due to gastroenteritis. That is, there is an inflammation or infection in the gastrointestinal tract. And the most common cause here is the infection due to waterborne disease. That is being the improper sterilization of water for drinking in our city. Because the war of Fallujah.
So if we can see that these soldiers say they were exposed to chemical and biological weapons in the first Gulf conflict, why would we deny it? Is it possible that many of those weapons of mass destruction, the biological agents, were given to Iraq by companies in the United States?
Well, there is absolutely no doubt that the United States government aided and abetted Saddam Hussein's chemical and biological warfare programs. We know that the Commerce Department issued licenses to various American companies to ship dual-use chemical or biological components to Iraq during the 1980s. And one of the biggest scandals, I think, in all of this is that one of the entities that was shipping pathogens, biological pathogens, to Iraq was the Center for Disease Control. In doing that, we created essentially our own Frankenstein in the Persian Gulf. That's really what it boils down to.
Ironically, Iraq was considered an ally of convenience during the Iran-Iraq War. By the time the Gulf War began, Iraq had produced 1,500 gallons of anthrax and botulism, a formidable arsenal.
So not only did Europe and the United States sell to Iraq
the capacity for biological warfare and chemical warfare, and possibly even some nuclear potential capacity. But the United States military gave to Saddam Hussein military intelligence, so he could use these chemical weapons on the Iranian troops coming into the country, the young, often young Revolutionary Guards.
One guy told me how he found a bullet, a shell, and the spent cartridge had on it, "Made in St. Louis." It broke his heart to see that the U.S. was working against their own troops.
So when the first Gulf War rolled around, and as the units from the 82nd Airborne began to roll across Iraq and see all of these known chemical weapons storage sites, they weren't told that they were chemical weapons storage sites. They were just told they were ammunition depots, even though CENTCOM, General Schwarzkopf's staff, had knowledge that some of those places were known storage facilities.
Now, how did we know that? Well, we had human spies that were basically passing that kind of information. So that was one of the major indicators that we had that the weapons were actually forward deployed.
And they blew up those depots.
It is now known and proven that the destruction by the Allies of nerve, chemical, and biological agents during the first Gulf War exposed our GIs to these dangerous elements. Could this have caused Gulf War syndrome?
We contaminated everybody in theater to some extent or another.
We used protective overgarments, boots, masks. I don't think you have seen a single battle scene from the Desert Storm War where our troops were not in MOPP gear.
DOD knew all the way back to 1988 with this report that dusty agents would penetrate our chemical suits in such profusion under such low wind conditions as to make our chemical suits totally and utterly useless. They still deployed us with this equipment. That, to me, is criminal negligence.
They were not prepared. They had no chemical suits that were acceptable for that area or for chemicals or biologicals. In fact, later on, Isratex, the company that provided 800,000 of those chemical suits, was found to have provided defective suits.
Once the cat was out of the bag, the policymakers decided that the best way to say that nothing had happened to soldiers was to develop a computer model. And in their first model run, they said potentially 50 people may have been exposed. They went back and then they came back several months later and said maybe 500 people had been exposed.
Then they increased it to over 1,000, then 5,000, and then around 10,000, then around 20,000. It kept growing and growing. And then we learned that maybe some of the biological and chemical plants that we blew up, that the plumes from those explosions went towards our troops, not away from our troops. And now they're acknowledging that it was low level, but possibly our 100,000 plus of our troops were exposed to that kind of exposure.
A top scientist at the Veterans Administration said today that soldiers face no greater long-term risk than would a factory worker in a chemical plant.
We feel that these are levels that are very near what people would be exposed to occupationally without having ill effects.
We've had a couple chemical alarm scares where we've had to put on our mask and our full chemical suit, and they all happen to be false alarms. There's little trace chemical in the air, but we think it's because the plants have been blown up in Iraq and the air is filtering this way. They say it's not enough to hurt you, though.
There is evidence that there were 14,000 chemical alarms that went off during the first Gulf War, all of which were ruled as negative by the Department of Defense. We know from the troops that were there that there were, in fact, positive alarms or positive findings. We know that the Fox vehicles, which are especially utilized for this purpose, found the traces of chemicals. Unfortunately, much of that information was lost as it was taken from them so that there would be no evidence that there were positive findings. We know in General Schwarzkopf's logs, his own personal CENTCOM logs, There is evidence there, and we have copies of 3 of those showing that there were in fact chemicals in the battlefield area.
The M8A1 alarm system will not only be one of the most reliable and effective warning devices in the field, its warning could well be what saves your life.
It would certainly be a major international embarrassment that our soldiers became sick and died because of weapons we had sold to Saddam Hussein. So rather than acknowledging the thousands of chemical alarms that went off during the Persian Gulf War were real, they had to say that not a single alarm was real. We are told by the White House, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the Veterans Administration, Gulf War syndrome is merely post-traumatic stress syndrome, and therefore we can't be treating them for all these diseases that they manifest because it's all in their mind.
The Department of Defense, the CIA, the Veterans Administration, and the White House all had to conspire together to withhold this information. To keep the public from understanding that there was a real illness, Gulf War illness, they utilized places like Rand Corporation, or they utilized the Institute of Medicine, NIH. They would get these agencies to issue reports that, well, we can't figure it out, we don't see any problem here, and therefore they must be fine. It's by giving an independent, alleged, third party the information and letting them to decide that there is no problem, and then the VA cannot treat for anything that does not exist. Most of the troops that placed Gulf War illness on their compensation or disability paperwork were turned down immediately.
Stress alone can produce a lot of the symptoms that the vets are having, and that doesn't mean that it's imaginary in their head. It's stress having a physiological and physical effect on their body.
Dr. Michael Kilpatrick of the Department of Defense insists that stress is still a factor in the veterans' illnesses.
We still don't have a test that says, yes, this exposure causes this brain damage.
Then we got reports how many of them had gone forward to the medics and complained about being sick during the war, and yet none of those records were available. So all of those records were sanitized. In fact, I even got a memo that all information regarding those who had been in for treatment or attempted to get some treatment during the Gulf War, those records should be removed.
After the first Gulf War conflict in 1991, the government, particularly the VA, was pushing the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder for armed forces personnel that were becoming sick. At the time, we knew that this couldn't be the reason because of the multiple signs and symptoms that are totally unrelated to post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, many of the medical problems, not psychological problems, that these Gulf War veterans had. So we knew it didn't fit.
I don't think you can possibly pass off the fact that a soldier has a deformed child to post-traumatic stress. Whether you believe in post-traumatic stress or not, and I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, but someone getting Hodgkin's disease, kidney failure, or having their children born with no limbs cannot possibly be viewed as a psychological problem.
And they actively participated in the character assassination of people, even in front of Congress. In testimony, Dr. Bernard Rosker would character assassinate anyone who said that veterans were ill for anything other than stress.
We are dedicated to trying to get at the bottom of why so many of our Gulf War veterans are ill today.
We need much more candor from the DOD and the VA and the CIA. This may sound a bit harsh, but some heads need to roll, because I really believe that all three, to various degrees, have participated in a cover-up. We're at that point now where it's almost criminal, the lack of cooperation we've received from various government agencies.
Clearly something happened. And to see, in essence, the stonewalling by both the CIA as well as the Pentagon, we can't let them just sweep this thing under the rug.
At the end of my career in the military, in this office, I had the opportunity to get promoted, and I was so disturbed that my legacy had been that I had served in Special Forces units and Ranger operations, and everybody thought I was the best thing since sliced bread. But then I get into this unit, and it's designed to screw over the veteran, and that was the last place that I worked. And I was so disturbed that I didn't want them to touch the rank that I was going to receive and pin it on my shoulders, because they weren't. Some of the people there were not honorable people. The leaders at the top of this organization, they purposely set out to manipulate science and to steer science away from looking at the real exposures.
Is there any indication now that the Department of Defense is taking this seriously?
There are a number of documents that prove that the Department of Defense failed to disclose the truth about what happened during the Gulf War. They know what's going on, but they don't want the American public to know what's happening. Senator Don Regal made a statement in one of the Senate reports that states, yes, there's a mental problem, all right, but it's over at the Department of Defense. The chemical weapons were seen at Camisea. They knew full well the countries that had transferred these biological and chemical agents. Our troops saw them over there. They knew the coloration of those weapons. They identified those weapons. And yet you have General Schwarzkopf and Powell doing everything they can to cover up the information that would have saved the lives of many of these troops.
My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. No act of theirs can alter the course or shake the resolve of this country. We are a peaceful people.
We know today from our testing that uranium dust and oxide is transferred extensively throughout the environment. It will contaminate air, water, and soil. And most specifically, as stated in the U.S. Army's own Common Task Training for Response to Uranium Munitions Use, it will contaminate food and water. One of the significant warnings that came about in a Pentagon briefing prior to Gulf War II was issued by U.S. Army Colonel J. Edgar Wakayama in a briefing to the Pentagon. In there, he identified all the serious adverse health effects, but one of the concerns that they expressed immediately was that children playing in these contaminated environments throughout Iraq or any other areas was used in Afghanistan, also into the Balkans, and now in Somalia, and also into Lebanon, would be exposed through inhalation, ingestion, and absorption, and therefore we would see significant adverse health effects within the child in the children population.
I think it was 2002, I gave evidence to the U.S. Congressional Committee on Veterans Affairs. They came to London, to the House of Lords, to take evidence on the health effects of depleted uranium. And they were quite impressed at the time, and they said that they were certainly ensured that this would be published. But in fact, I never heard any more from this, so I imagine that somebody squashed it at some point down the line.
We've taken our cameras into Iraq. Let's show you the impact of depleted uranium on the children, on the pregnant women, on virtually all the citizens of Iraq who have to breathe it in every single day.
The fact is that Iraq is now a radioactive zone, and really everybody should leave it, including the troops. This is like Chernobyl.
Many Iraqis can hear me tonight in a translated radio broadcast, and I have a message for them. If we must begin a military campaign, it will be directed against the lawless men who rule your country, and not against you.
There's no question about depleted uranium. The amount I don't think we will ever know. However, those troops are now exposed and have become ill as a result of it. And we know that there are thousands and thousands of troops that have lung disorders and kidney disorders as a result of the delayed reaction to the radiation. Depleted uranium, which is really not depleted, is simply a radioactive weapon. It is, in fact, a weapon of mass destruction.
We will tear down the apparatus of terror, and we will help you to build a new Iraq that is prosperous and free.
Our weapons have caused incredible disability, not only to U.S. troops. They're having an epidemic of cancer in children now in Iraq. Little children are dying steadily in huge numbers from their inhalation of the radioactive iodine.
The tyrant will soon be gone. The day of your liberation is near.
And they don't know of the billions of years of legacy this weapon will leave behind.
The use of uranium munitions and the destruction of the Iraqi's infrastructure has turned Iraq into a radiological and chemically toxic nightmare, a sewer, a garbage dump for eternity.
What is depleted uranium? How does it manifest itself, and what danger is it? The Pentagon says, no problem. Depleted uranium, it's safe. The GIs say, not true. Depleted uranium is a causative factor in what is called Gulf War syndrome.
Uranium is very easy to obtain. Actually, it's cheaper to buy uranium than ice cream. Uranium is abundant in the crust of the earth. Depleted uranium is abundant as the waste product of the enrichment of uranium. Uranium, whether depleted, natural, or enriched, all of them are emitters of alpha particles. When it ignites, it releases atomic particles of depleted uranium, and they are baked by the high temperature to the invisible particles of dust that are suspended in the atmosphere all the time. Now, in those dust particles, which are permanently suspended, permanently inhaled and exhaled, uranium isotopes are present. Depleted uranium enters the body and gets lodged in the lymph nodes, which have capacity of producing a lymphopoietic system.
Now, they're not soluble. This is the key to uranium oxide. It's extremely insoluble. The half-life of uranium oxide in people is more than 15 years. This is the half-life. That means if you take in a certain amount of uranium, half of that will still be in your body 15 years after you've inhaled it. Now, it's always going to be in the same place. This little particle will be in the same place, and it will be shooting out alpha particles, and the cells around this particle will get a very high radiation dose. And because of this high radiation dose, those cells can mutate. And if they mutate, then they can go on to form cancer. Uranium binds very strongly to DNA. The affinity constant of uranium for DNA is 10 to the power 10. But if the uranium is on the DNA, obviously it's going to have a greater effect than if it's just dispersed through the whole body. So this affinity for DNA is very critical.
A recent study by the National Academy of Sciences called the Bear-7 report, The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, shows that there is no dose of radiation that is safe. The uranium can be then translocated by white blood cells to the lymph glands in the chest, where it can cause lymphomas. It also is translocated to the bone, where it can cause bone cancer or leukemia. It's excreted through the kidney, where in high doses it can cause acute nephritis, but it also can cause kidney cancer. It's excreted in the semen, and in that form it can mutate the genes in the sperm to damage the developing embryo.
How could you use hundreds of tons of depleted uranium over Iraq knowing that its half-life is 4.5 billion years? It'll blow in the sands of the desert forever. It'll be in the air that the Iraqi people breathe. It'll be in the vegetables they eat, and it cannot be filtered out of the water supply. So the further irony is that in the process of liberating Iraq, we have devastated its environment for eternity.
The people of Iraq have the same illnesses and sicknesses and conditions that our own soldiers have. When you also add the dimension that depleted uranium weapons are considered illegal under international law analysis, Americans have to confront the fact we are killing countless of innocent civilians.
Just imagine if any American city had 12,000 homes destroyed, causing the people in them to suffer and die. Hospitals were bombed, utility companies destroyed, and there was no effort whatsoever to help the suffering civilians.
The estimates as far as the Iraqi casualties amongst the children and amongst the civilian population of Iraq since the Gulf War I is on the estimate of 2.5 million. And that has been reported in numerous conferences throughout the world and numerous times, again by Iraqi physicians, the United Nations physicians.
During the sanctions, the Iraqi people said 200 children, 5 and under, per day were dying. We don't know right now how many children are dying, although recently I had a report from a friend in Iraq who told me that 150 children per day are dying from dirty water diarrhea and dehydration and lack of access to antibiotics and lack of access to hospitals, because in this environment of intense lack of security, it's very impossible to take your children for the treatment that they need. Many physicians, 25 to 50% of physicians, are estimated to have left the country. So access to appropriate medical care becomes more and more difficult for these people.
Stay in the hospital. We try to receive some people and to help the people, the injured people, because we know that there is no any way to the people to take the medical supply, only the hospital. So we try and we go and talk with the American and Marines people that there are some injured people inside the city, try to help us to bring those people to manage them, but they refuse. They refuse to open any bridge and they refuse to bring any injured people from the city.
What we're doing in Iraq in the name of freedom and democracy and all this good stuff, we are maintaining the death rate for civilians. We've seen under occupation child mortality figures increase. We know there's no personal security. We know that children are no longer able to have proper health care or go to school. Their plight is in fact worse than it was under sanctions before Mr. Bush.
That Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda.
There was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
How do we restore confidence that Americans may have in their leaders and to be sure that the information they're getting now is correct?
That's a great question. First, just if I might correct a misperception, I don't think we ever said, at least I know I didn't say, that there was a direct connection between September the 11th and Saddam Hussein.
During our filming in Iraq, all of the physicians interviewed stated the same thing, that for the first time in their lifetime, they are seeing rare cancers in children and birth defects in babies far beyond anything that they've ever experienced in Iraq's history. In fact, they've stated that 125 to 150 Iraqi babies are dying each day from what they believe is from the contamination of the air, water, and soil, and also from depleted uranium. We also found that people are afraid to have children in Iraq today because the parents are hearing of birth defects that are widely occurring in babies around the region.
Children play in tanks which have been destroyed and are radioactive, and they can inhale this stuff. Children play in the dirt and they inhale the radioactive material. The dust storms which occur frequently, sandstorms in that area of the world, blow the stuff up and people inhale it. My colleagues in Basra noticed an increased incidence of childhood cancer. Why children? Because they're very sensitive to radiation, 10 to 20 times more sensitive and susceptible to getting cancer from radiation than adults. The incidence of childhood cancer in Basra now has gone up 700% or 7 times. We've never seen this in medicine before.
Depleted uranium, it's a very dense, heavy metal, and it's able to penetrate the most armor of any type of material used. It is a very minor amount of radioactivity, but it's not anything that, as long as it's in its bullet form, it can be stored, and it's not any type of hazardous material. Once it hits a vehicle and vaporizes, then it becomes more of a hazardous material.
So we decided, just as an experiment, to have a look at the uranium filters at the atomic weapons establishment in Aldermaston in Berkshire in the United Kingdom, some 2,000 odd miles away from Iraq. And what we discovered to our amazement when we plotted this data, and when we looked at this time series from 1998 right the way through to 2004, we found there was only one big accession, only one big peak in the uranium concentration in Britain, and that was at the time of the Gulf War, Second Gulf War. So we know now also that not only uranium is extremely hazardous and it causes all these things that I've said, these cancers and leukemias and birth defects and so forth, but it also can be dispersed over very large distances, which effectively makes the use of uranium a weapon of, well, not mass destruction, but indiscriminate effect. And that makes it illegal under all the conventions of war, certainly the Geneva Convention. And so people all over the world are going to inhale this dust in various concentrations depending upon the weather patterns and the weather flows. So there will be a big spike of uranium genetic damage in the world genome population, not just in the people, but in the animals, in the earthworms, in the birds, in the rats, in the deer, in every single living system that lives in zones where this uranium will have gone to. And this will lead to increases in infertility, into increases in birth defects, increases in cancer, increases in a whole range of illnesses. It's a very, very serious problem.
I examined 24 veterans from the Army Reserve Unit, which just returned from the Persian Gulf. Just as a matter of curiosity, I took the urine samples of those patients and sent them to radiochemistry laboratory of the United States Army in the Aberdeen, Maryland. But I waited for 3 months for radiochemistry lab to give me the results. They never contacted me. So one day I went on the telephone and spoke with the head of that laboratory, and he claimed he never received my samples. So I went down to uranium registry, and we traced through the US mail that samples were actually sent and delivered to radiochemistry lab in Aberdeen. I contacted them again. Samples were discovered on some shelf in the basement. They were analyzed, but they were all negative. So I said, fair enough, they're all negative. I will analyze them at some other place. Then hospital management came to me, including chief of staff and hospital director, suggesting that I do not do these studies because it would be futile work. And I said, I don't think so, because my professional judgment suggests that there could be radioactive contamination of soldiers who present with this strange wasting disease with the symptoms that were totally non-specific. So I took those samples of urine and sent them to the different lab, an eminent laboratory in Canada at Memorial University in Newfoundland, where we analyzed those samples, and 67% were positive. I wrote a letter to President Bill Clinton in mid-90s when I was harassed by the Veterans Administration to stop my work. And in my letter to President Bill Clinton, I said in one sentence, I have been delegated by the government of the United States to take care of the sick veterans in my department. And disappearing samples, destroyed records, and so on, really point to nothing else than conspiracy against the veterans of the United States. President Bill Clinton received my letter, and he appointed a commission to investigate my charges. And it went to the repository of the government bureaucracy with nothing much coming out of it, except for RAND reports, 2 huge books, which made the statement that there is no risk and danger from depleted uranium.
What we have seen in the Iraqi population and the adults and the children from Gulf War I into Gulf War II is significant respiratory problems. We're seeing significant kidney problems. We're seeing significant rashes. We're seeing incredible birth defects. And these birth defects range the whole area from malformed limbs or limbs that are missing to the same thing where you have all types of, say, for example, a single eye or one eye is missing or something like that. And deformities are just extensive. Again, this is something that has been observed repeatedly from Gulf War I, has been observed in the Balkans, been observed in Afghanistan, and has been observed in other areas throughout the United States where uranium munitions were used and children were conceived or exposed.
One atom of alpha-emitting radioisotope in the vicinity of highly radiosensitive cell, like stem cell or cell of ovary or the testicle or the mucosa, have capacity to damage those cells. Uranium, depleted or non-depleted, but depleted in particular, is dangerous in the vicinity of non-differentiated cells because it can cause the genetic changes, and it can cause changes in the many generations that are following our time. If anyone asks a question, is depleted uranium dangerous? The answer is categorically yes. It is dangerous. It is alpha emitter.
It is used in the 30-millimeter shell, 50-millimeter shell, bunker buster bombs, cruise missiles. Depleted uranium is everywhere. It is twice as dense as lead. It goes through a tank like butter. And it is very effective, which is why it's used. Now, the problem with the second Gulf War is we're finding that they're much sicker much faster. They're returning and they're getting the blind eye from the Pentagon a lot sooner and being ruled PTSD, medicated with psychotropic drugs, and sent back out to the streets. And our concern is that the number of homicides and suicides that we're seeing in the military right now are a direct result of the neurotoxic effects from the depleted uranium.
You can look at the tank. Yeah, it's a great weapon, goes right through the tank. But then you look at the pictures of the deformed babies. Then you read the statistics of American soldiers and unusual cancers. Then you look at the statistics of many, many other illnesses and conditions, and you say, oh, wait a minute, this is inhumane. This weapon is making people sick who aren't even soldiers, and not only that, it's killing people and maiming them in a way that is simply inhumane.
Being patriotic and supporting the troops is not buying some yellow plastic magnetic ribbon made in China and putting it on your car. It is standing up against the odds of saying, no, sir, you are lying.
The evidence, the epidemiological evidence for the health effects of uranium are very confused, And the reason for this is that the people who do these sorts of studies are usually people who are funded by the military, and so there haven't been a lot of official or even dare I say it, very good epidemiological studies of Gulf War veterans.
The uranium munitions were not only used against Iraqi armor in vehicles, but they were extensively used apartment buildings, water treatment, sewage sanitation facilities, hospitals, and all kinds of other structures. So we have thorough contamination. We do not have the resources, we do not have the capability to clean up this contamination, which is not just in a limited area, but just like an entire checkerboard covered in the entire region.
We are suffering also from the pollution of our environment after the war. So we daily we see many congenital malformation among the newly born babies, and also increase the mortality rate among the pediatric age group. In addition to the other problems that deficiency of medical equipment, medical incubators, and also medical monitors, we are losing our children without management.
One thing that the Department of Defense is trying to prevent is from the American public and all the citizens of the world, and also the residents of these nations, from knowing exactly what the true casualty count is. If the American public sees these documents, which should be readily available on different websites, and they find out what the true casualties are, what the true cost of war is, then they would be in a total uproar, and we would see an immediate cessation to the use of uranium munitions. General Erich Shinseki, when he was the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army, had issued all the orders mandating thorough and prompt medical care for all exposed individuals. He had issued the direct orders himself, ordering thorough, prompt environmental remediation. He had issued the orders himself, mandating thorough training for all individuals. This has not occurred. General Shinseki's initial order was from August of 1993. So it's always been known.
Probably right now, as we speak, the most phone calls that I'm getting are coming from those troops that have come back from Iraq with an exposure to depleted uranium. And they're confused. They don't think right. They have an inability to handle their temper. They are basically compromised individuals. But you don't look for what you don't want to find.
I was with the tank battalion. Tanks are armored with depleted uranium, and the ammunition is depleted uranium. I was around it a lot. I actually asked my doctor, because I was a hospital corpsman, so I asked the medical officer that was with us, and what he told us about depleted uranium is it was completely safe, that we would have to virtually eat it in order for there to be any kind of problems. I've since learned that that was an outright lie.
The leaders haven't told the soldiers. The commanders haven't told the soldiers. The leaders and the commanders are not complying with their own requirements. And the Department of Defense leaders have done everything they can to prevent that information from getting out. It's real simple. If we told the soldiers how hazardous uranium munitions use is, told them about the serious adverse health and environmental effects and what's really happened, they'd never use them. They'd never go near it. And the U.S. would be forced to stop it, and we would no longer thoroughly contaminate the earth, air, water, soil, and food, and result in consequent adverse health and environmental effects. It's real simple. Inform the soldier. Tell them the risks. And when you send them to combat and they get exposed and they get sick, you provide prompt and effective medical care. And don't argue and don't debate with them. Don't destroy the records. Don't destroy the medical records. Don't destroy the personnel records as occurring in St. Louis, Missouri, the National Records Center. Tell the truth. Take care of the American warrior. They've earned it, or we've earned it, and I've earned it.
What about the women and children, the brave women who have served in Iraq? The brave wives of soldiers, the hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqi women and children. Let's take a look at some of the biological effects that they are suffering from.
I am really dreadfully afraid to try and conceive and carry a child. I am just looking at my hair and my memory and my skin and things like that. I can't imagine what's happening on the inside of me and what may have happened to that very fragile genetic material that's in the ovaries. It scares me to death to try and think about carrying a child.
I had one doctor tell me, he was an Air Force doctor, matter of fact, captain, who did not physically examine me, but spent 10 minutes with me in his examining room asking me questions. And after discussing the gynecological problems, he looked me point blank in the face and asked me why I even wanted to get pregnant, why even try. I left there in tears that day.
problem is the increase in the number of the congenital anomalies of the fetus. And we have many problems while dealing with these cases. The termination of pregnancy in the first trimester needs many drugs which are unavailable because of the vaginal condition of our country and of our city, Al-Fayouj.
And the incidence of severe congenital anomalies, babies being born with no brains or single eyes or no arms, has also gone up 700%. So women are too terrified to deliver their babies.
Well, now my son was born with a birth defect as a result of the war. Now he's had cleft lip and palate. He's had 3 surgeries. He needs at least 2 more. VA is not covering any of that. They've denied all of our benefits. He has speech therapy. He has tubes in his ears. He's had constant ear infections, so now he has hearing loss in one side. He has no father. He died when he was 2. He was not pleased that we were going to have another baby. Not that he didn't want to have another baby, but he was afraid. He was afraid of what he was exposed to. I didn't share that concern at that time. I was just thrilled. And then my son was born, and my husband carried the guilt of that child until he died. He carried that guilt with him. He always blamed himself for it.
In order not to disturb their apparent equilibrium in which they are, soldiers, veterans, used to take the line of the least resistance, and that is keeping silent. Some of them speak, but not too loud and not too long, because either by risk of losing their livelihood or by emotional pressure from different sources, they give up and they accept their fate.
To think that they're not aware is a lie. All 435 offices on the House side I have visited so many times I can't even keep track through the years. They're not aware of our plight. They've been made aware of, and they don't care. We go in, meet with them, give them a briefing, give them the information, and we come out with laws that are one piece at a time. And we're 16 years into this, and we still have veterans that aren't getting treatment, that aren't getting diagnosed the appropriate way. And they're dying.
What we have seen now, and very specifically, the members of the New York Army National Guard, the 442nd Military Police Unit, they were deployed over to Iraq. They were exposed and put into areas where it had not been cleaned up as required. They were not provided the training. They were not provided equipment. And one of those soldiers conceived a child after he had been exposed, confirmed hot, and that child was born with similar birth defects that are observed readily in all the other children, whether in the Balkans, Afghanistan, up at Concord, New Hampshire, or in Iraq.
Can you imagine that you're paying for this horrible weapon to be used? You're paying for soldiers to be trained without real training, without real knowledge of the weapons they're using. They don't know about the chromosomal damage. They don't know about the birth defects to their own kids.
We have to go back to the basic premise. The Los Alamos Memorandum, issued in March of 1991, followed up by the United States Army Environmental Policy Institute directive from December of 92, was very clear. Thou shalt ensure the use of uranium munitions in combat through active proponency and altering of all documents that refer to the serious adverse health and environmental effects.
Just imagine, in a thought experiment, if you will, that when the human race has wiped itself out with all the toxins and absurdities that it goes in for, that a Martian historian lands in a flying saucer, and we're now watching a Martian television program about this lost civilization on Earth. And the Martian historian might say, well, here's a race that lived on a planet where there was only one really serious radiological hazard, a substance which was safely dispersed in the rocks, so that all that happened was this very small amount of radiation came out of the rocks and had very little effect on them. And what did they do? Well, they took these rocks, they went all over the world to find where these rocks were, and then they pulled them out of the ground with huge diggers, and at vast expense and with enormous factories, they created a very pure version of this substance. And then if that isn't enough, then what they did is they took this substance and they made it into bombs, and they dropped it on each other in such a way that it was most widely dispersed and had the maximum possible radiological, cancer and genetic damage effect. This is what they did. Well, what can you do with such a rate? Between 1991 and 1999, measurements it became possible to measure depleted uranium in the environment, and by 2003, Gulf War II, for the big bombs, the bombs that started to be employed, they started to use ordinary uranium. The ordinary uranium could not be distinguished from uranium in the environment. Even if we don't have evidence that this is so, it would be almost likely that it would be so, and that the US would start using ordinary uranium in big cruise missiles and bunker-busting bombs. The point is this, that we have measured large amounts of uranium, ordinary uranium, in the urine of the Gulf War II veterans. So putting all this together, and also adding in the fact that very recently I have measured uranium isotopes in craters in southern Lebanon, in the town of Khiam, and also in an air filter in Beirut, which show that the Israelis are certainly using ordinary uranium and enriched uranium. And so something very funny is going on with uranium weapons at the moment, which we need to investigate.
How is it possible that a person who never went to the Gulf now suffers from Gulf War syndrome? Lots of GIs are now sick, but a lot of them were stateside. What did they all have in common, those that went and those that did not? Botulism and anthrax vaccines. Let's explore the role that vaccines have in Gulf War syndrome.
It will be gas. It will be nasty. These atropine oxime injectors go along with your PV pill packs. In the event that you're attacked by nerve agents such as SAMAD, these agents will produce casualties immediately if you do not deploy these countermeasures. F***ing Ricky Tick.
Why in the f*** we've already taken a set of PV pills and just now be issued the f***ing injector?
Shut the f*** up! I'm sick of your shit. All right, man, calm down. Look, they don't want chemically dead fighters on CNN. Just sign it, Kruger.
I was exposed to numerous vaccinations. I can't even tell you how many because they just lined us up and we would do like 3 or 4 shots in one station and more shots in the next station. My left leg began to swell, especially my ankle. I've always been very athletic, kickboxing, yoga, everything. And one morning I woke up and my ankle was enormous. I couldn't get my jeans on or off because my calf was so swollen. I had felt tingling in my ankle before it started, but I, thought it was nothing. And when I woke up in the morning, it was huge. My life is affected today. It's weird. I deal with a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment because I hate feeling or thinking I'm less than. And I really feel that way with my leg. It's been really hard to deal with that. So I have to maneuver to hide it when I can, but I don't have any answers for anyone who asks me what's wrong with my leg. I'm young. There shouldn't be anything wrong with me.
I woke up one morning and these knuckles in my hand were like golf balls, and I just kind of blew it off. Maybe I injured something or an old injury, and about 2 days later I woke up and my feet were swollen like elephantitis, purple. I couldn't walk on them. They were very tingly and sensitive, so I would have to crawl. And at this point in my life we had a newborn son who I was trying to take care of also. And so I would have to crawl to his crib and lift myself up and get him out of the crib and crawl to the, I mean, it was amazing.
During the Gulf War, I was a shot team or a vaccination team that went out and gave out the prostragmine, bromide, and the anthrax shots. My shot team gave out 75,000 injections in a 2-week period. So needless to say, my thumb had a blister on it.
There are a lot of people in the alternative medical community, including well-educated MDs, who feel that there have been no significant long-term studies of the effects of vaccination, and that to a very great extent there is a myopia on the part of the medical community not looking at long-term harm that vaccines cause.
The toxins that are in vaccines include mercury, aluminum, and squalene. Squalene is an oil distantly related to cholesterol that has a very interesting effect when it goes into the human body in the form of an injection. Patients who've received the squalene anthrax vaccine have ended up with illnesses like multiple sclerosis and systemic lupus erythematosus and bronchial asthma and psoriasis, and the whole rash of autoimmune diseases can be brought on in these military persons who served in the Gulf War.
Because of the potential anthrax threat, last year the Defense Department ordered vaccinations, and one of the first in line was Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Eric Benken. Despite isolated protests, the vast majority of medical experts endorsed the vaccine's use. And despite charges that the so-called Gulf War syndrome and anthrax are connected, Huxell says that's just not true. The Defense Department continues to stress the safety of the anthrax vaccine, and all troops headed for the Persian Gulf receive the inoculation series.
One of the things that scares me about the anthrax vaccine is it's been stockpiled in big quantities for use in the United States. And obviously, I feel very strongly that anyone who takes any vaccine that has squalene in it is risking their life.
I served in Iraq, and the one thing that I remember was that we received inoculations that we were told we weren't able to know what they were. And I had an adverse reaction right there on the border of Syria and Turkey, where my lungs started to fill with fluid, and for about 2 weeks I was pretty sick.
I believe that I was compromised by having too many shots, or as us in the military call it, gang vaccines. I don't believe that having 6 vaccines in one day strengthens the human body. I think it weakens it. I think that when I had the anthrax shots in the Gulf theater, that it weakened my immune system.
I took a series of 3 shots of anthrax, and that I basically was a turning point of my, I think, problems.
One reason why I decided to get out of the military, because I did not want to be put in a position where I had to tell people that you have to take these shots, that you have to take these drugs, and then you end up getting sick, and I have to live with that feeling. Because I know what I lived, I know what others have lived that I've talked with and been around with all these years, and I didn't want to deal with that.
You've got people chronically disabled. They're going to be, as long as they're alive, they're going to be liabilities for the American government to take care of. So admitting that the vaccines were a contributing factor in a lot of this illness would be a financial burden for the U.S. government.
Real soldiers deserve real help. Support veterans with Gulf War illness.
Researchers say they have isolated an unusual microorganism in the blood of sick veterans.
one they think was genetically altered as though it were designed for germ warfare.
Much of their research has pointed to a very small, little understood type of bacteria called mycoplasma.
You've tested hundreds and hundreds of different individuals.
We've tested hundreds of individuals. That's correct.
Many, what's the percentage that you found were infected with this bacteria?
About 45%.
4 different approaches to the Pentagon, including Colin Powell, failed. All interviews were ultimately denied. Why the reluctance to talk about this?
Something needs to be done before my wife dies, before I die, or any other Gulf War vets die.
Some are claiming that they were human guinea pigs and that historically the military has used our GIs for their experiments. Could this be why our troops are suffering from Gulf War syndrome?
Well, we know that the military has been involved in testing of biologic agents, and in fact we think that the mycoplasma is an incapacitating biologic agent, not designed to immediately kill people, but designed to render them ill. And one of the things that we've felt all along is that this is one big test, one big scientific experiment to see the results of a weaponized mycoplasma, a weaponized incapacitating biological warfare agent on large numbers of people. We know that experiments were conducted in the Texas Department of Corrections. These were experiments that were done under the supervision of the Army and people that work for the Army. These experiments were done on prisoners without full informed consent. Many prisoners died. We somehow got involved in it because the prison guards were getting sick, because these are slowly transmittable infections, they're airborne infections. And they were coming to us for help because they had the same signs and symptoms as the Gulf War veterans.
There's a Senate report 103-97 that states, during the past 50 years, hundreds of thousands of our military have been experimented upon without their knowledge or consent. This report, which was really never supposed to see public distribution, mentions Operation Whitecoat, the use of a drug called BZ, the use of atomic veterans to stand and face the atomic blast. Part of what we're saying is experimentation must stop. We have no idea how many experiments have gone on. We need to have guarantees that when you go into the military, you will not be experimented upon without your consent. Now, as a nurse, I thought I would be aware of this. I thought I would be more conscious of what I was being given. But yet, many times, the bottles were not labeled, or you weren't told, or it was none of your business. And that has to stop. We are not going into the military to lose our constitutional rights.
As for the U.S. Army, we requested all the documents they had on these experiments back in September. At this time, they're still searching.
The U.S. Army has done most of the research on Mycoplasma fermentans, which is the species that they call Mycoplasma incognitus, which is a substrain of Mycoplasma fermentan. The difference is that the incognitus strain we feel is a weaponized mycoplasma. It has some unusual gene sequences in it that would only be there if one were weaponizing this particular microbe. That is making it more resistant to a hostile environment, less sensitive, for example, to drying or to extreme heat, more pathogenic, more able to invade cells, and more able to suppress the immune system. All of these characteristics are found in this unusual strain of mycoplasma that we found in the Gulf War veterans.
Dr. Garth Nicholson, a highly respected scientist, claims that our GIs were exposed to a genetically modified mycoplasm which could have caused Gulf War syndrome.
They wanted to implement West Nile vaccine when in reality we didn't even have West Nile in this country. But the United States government, with the approval of the CDC and the Department of Commerce, sold West Nile fever virus to Iraq. And we've got the documents proving that, along with the batch number and the date where the West Nile was sold.
One of the interesting aspects, and actually horrifying aspects, of the Gulf War conflict is that when the veterans came back and became ill, many started showing autoimmune and neurological signs and symptoms, and one would not expect this at all from the types of exposures that they were received or exposed to in the Gulf. We have found that there are certain infections that are found in the Gulf War veterans that are often associated with these disorders, such as mycoplasmal infections that we found associated with multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease, and other autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis and so on. And these infections were found in a very high percentage of Gulf War veterans. In our studies, approximately 40 to 45% of the Gulf War veterans who became sick after the war had this one type of infection, a mycoplasmal infection. Now we know that some of the vaccines were contaminated. In fact, there's a study that was done by the VA in San Diego that showed that some of the military vaccines were contaminated with mycoplasma.
The mysterious mix of symptoms, which includes chronic fatigue, headaches, rashes, and joint pain. This bacterium, Mycoplasma fermentans incognitus, may cause it.
One of the aspects of these infections, or properties of these infections, is that they do invade into the central nervous system, and they can invade nerve cells and cause brain swelling and characteristics which can cause brain image changes that are seen in these veterans. These infections are very difficult to treat, particularly when they become central nervous system infections. And if they're not treated in a timely manner, it's too late. Most of these people will have irreversible brain damage and eventually die of their infections and the resulting diseases.
Based on any number of studies, we're very confident that these patients are infected with a stealth adapted virus.
How is it possible that some GIs ended up having this very bizarre mycoplasma? How did they get it in their bodies?
My accumulated evidence as a researcher is now indicating that this may in fact have been an experiment wherein many troops were vaccinated with an experimental vaccine.
One issue that has not been addressed by the mainstream media. Have the military, the Defense Department, the CIA, and others used our soldiers as human guinea pigs?
Well, one of the interesting aspects of this whole story is the fact that the government, at least pathologists that work for the government, that work for the U.S. Army, actually hold the patents on the type of mycoplasma that we found. And this may be one reason why they're denying that this mycoplasma is involved in these illnesses. Ordinarily, these types of contaminations wouldn't cause a problem because they're very minor contaminants, except when someone is immunosuppressed. And one becomes immunosuppressed because of the chemicals, because of the multiple vaccinations that were given in a very short period of time. Because of we feel the immune suppression, these minor infections became major infections. And this is what we think is causing the illness in the families. We found that it slowly spread to immediate family members, and the adults in the families would come down with fibromyalgia syndrome or chronic fatigue syndrome, but the children, very interestingly, were most often diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorders, such as autism, Asperger's disease, and so on. And so wherever we see family members getting sick, we know that can't be post-traumatic stress disorder, because you can't pass or transfer post-traumatic stress disorder to someone who hasn't been exposed to the Gulf War, for example.
I've talked to thousands of them. I've met with them around the country. I've seen their scars, their emotional scars and their physical scars. I've seen the families that have been destroyed. They ask only that they be compensated and have some form of treatment to make their lives better. I am not being compensated, nor have I asked for any compensation from the Department of Defense. I am a nurse. I served as a flight nurse, and I served proudly. And I loved every minute of being in support of Operation Desert Storm. No prouder moment than putting on that flight suit and going to do a live mission. There is a flight nurse's creed, and it's very important to me. I will summon every resource to prevent the triumph of death over life. This I will do. I will not falter in war or in peace. And that's why I'm doing what I am doing, is I want these troops to get the help that they so deserve.
After I got back, I went to the blood bank to donate blood. I was told, oh, you're a Gulf War vet, you can't donate blood. I said, why? Well, we just got word that you can't. I find that a little disturbing.
The Centers for Disease Control says it is not aware of any scientific evidence to suggest that illnesses among Gulf War veterans are caused by infectious agents.
One troop told me that he had been to the VA numerous times to get help. He was losing the feeling in his legs. And finally, he called me one day and he said, Joyce, I'm going to the VA. This is the last time. He said, I'm in a wheelchair now. My wife is going to take me. My wife and my 2 kids are going to go over there, and we're going to try for the very last time to try and get some help. When he went to the VA, and he called me later that night to tell me what had happened, they told him, and then took his wife aside and said, we did a psychological evaluation on your husband, and we found that he's really a latent homosexual. And that just enraged his wife so much. They literally had to remove her from the VA. She said, how dare you say that in front of my husband, in front of my 2 children here? You know that's not the truth. But they would do anything, absolutely anything, to keep it off an objective physical finding. They used subjective and said, well, you're just imagining it, or you've got some type of psychosomatic reaction, you want to be sick, or you're just trying to get compensation. And for the majority of these troops, that just, it hurt them more, I think, than actually the illness itself.
I've heard recently a lot of comparison of this war to Vietnam, which is justified in a way. I've also heard from the other side that the casualties we've suffered is just a drop in the bucket compared to what was lost in Vietnam or what was lost in World War II. Well, I say, who's determining the value of human life? When did the body count determine the value of the cause? That's what I say.
What could have caused hundreds of thousands of GIs who fought in the first Gulf War to be suffering with so many debilitating conditions? And then you have about another 150,000 suffering from the second Gulf conflict.
I think it's a combination of about 4 or 5 different things that they were exposed to.
Well, many believe that they were exposed to experimental vaccines, and these experimental vaccines included botulism and anthrax. Also, they were used as human guinea pigs. They were injected with a genetically engineered mycoplasma. They were also exposed to depleted uranium, which even to this day the government claims is not a problem. We've been told that there were no biological weapons, no nerve gas, no chemical weapons, yet there's abundant evidence to the contrary. Why couldn't the Pentagon, the Defense Department, and the White House just be honest and let the soldiers know what potential risks were involved? In all this debate, nothing is more important than what happened to those whose lives are now at risk.
I think as most veterans, as we look around what has happened throughout the years to veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, that nothing comes forward without squeezing and asking DOD, is this real? Did this happen?
They pushed the Gulf War vets into PTSD. It was not PTSD. It was physiological damage by the exposure agents that we had. If you push this off on post-traumatic stress, It costs them less money. They don't have to do all those heavy-duty diagnostic tests that you would have to for the physical damage.
It puts the onus back on the veterans themselves in a way, instead of on these toxic exposures. I think that this is absolutely disgusting, to try and blame the veterans themselves for their illnesses.
If 80,000 contaminated U.S. soldiers from the Gulf War I are granted some kind of monetary compensation, we are talking about billions upon billions of dollars, which nobody can afford. To decontaminate contaminated area of Iraq would be useless and futile effort, and to pay compensation for everybody who is contaminated and found positive in our studies would be enormous commitment of money. Nobody wants to admit that they are doing indiscriminate damage to the soldiers and non-soldiers alike.
So what America is conducting is a nuclear war in the cradle of civilization. This is a war crime beyond belief, because it will be creating cancer for the rest of time, particularly in children and deformed babies, as we are seeing now.
If the people in this country knew the truth behind this, it could bring down the government as we know it. That's how serious it is.
The magnitude of this is that we've had to go to the press. And we've even been shut down through the press. Early on, I was told, be careful what you say, because we still need access to this active duty base. And if we have any trouble with the coverage that we're giving on this, then we'll have to shut it down.
The American media is supposed to be the guardian of our nation. They're supposed to identify the problems. They're supposed to report the problems. They're supposed to make Americans aware of the problems, so that Americans can act. And that means contact members of Congress, contact members of the Department of Defense, contact the President and demand action, demand compliance with existing protocols, requirements, regulations, and orders and guidelines. They're not thoroughly reporting what has occurred. They're just not doing it, and for many reasons. Number one, the members of the Department of Defense and Administration, those leaders, exercise executive authority, and they simply lie about what's been known. Or they exert tremendous pressure to include retaliation against anybody that speaks out. And then the other last part is the members of the media, those responsible as guardians of our nation, simply don't want to report the total failures by the leaders in the Department of Defense, and the Center for Disease Control, the National Academy of Sciences, Federal Drug Administration, or the VA, or the White House. They lose access, they lose everything if they tell the truth.
And the American people don't know about it, because the New York Times wouldn't print the article I wrote about it, and the Pentagon is sitting on the information and won't allow it to be published.
When we talk about those running for president, I want to open people's eyes right now. Miss Clinton, as First Lady, met with a few Gulf War vets, knew there was a problem. What did they do? They formed a Presidential Advisory Committee, and through the whole course of that, and even when it got extended 18 months, we were still battling with that committee to get to the truth. They spent all the money, all the time and effort treating us psychologically. The research money that went into that direction. So, you know, they look good when you think, well, we got a Presidential Advisory Committee on Gulf War illness. The people that were put on those committees were there to delay us, to deny us. When we had anybody that would listen, officially, whatever, we were there telling them, pleading with them, pushing them, trying to convince them, trying to show them facts and figures. They blew us off and proceeded on their pre-planned agenda. And to believe that these guys are on TV giving 5-minute speeches on the Hill right now saying they support the troops. Where are they when you need them to sign on to bills and get bills through? First Lady Hillary Clinton, Senator. We had reports, we had meetings, hearings, and the Presidential Advisory Committee got extended another 18 months. And all during that time, all the research money and all the push was towards stress instead of the actual exposures and why we were sick and what help we really needed.
It was a sham. It was a trail of tears that paraded around this country, yanking the hearts out of veterans, thinking that they were going to get some resolution to their problems. I saw these troops, many of them, give up their last dollar to be able to go and speak before the commission, to help them understand that they really were sick. They had no idea what was really going on. You could see that this was just simply a situation where they tried to placate the veterans, quiet them down. The goal was find out what all these troops know, find out what documents they have, what evidence they have, get them to turn it over so that there won't be enough evidence out there that they can expose what really took place during the Gulf War. And I've talked to many physicians in the military who've told me, yeah, we know there really is an illness, but we're not allowed to treat for it. One physician told me he left the military based on the fact that he basically watched a troop die that they did not want to admit to chemical exposure.
They don't do this on their own. They do it when veterans get up there. We call it the squeaky wheel syndrome. We go up there and raise Cain with them when we get in the press to get action. Ask your Gulf War vets if they've had MRI, RSs, or SPECT scans showing the damage in their brain that is physical. Have they had viral testing? Have they had the testing they needed to guide them to the treatment that they need desperately? No. They've let us medically deteriorate in front of them.
And there were many moves, many conferences held in Washington to which I was frequently invited, and the result of all of these conferences was just eating sandwiches and drinking coffee and collecting government's per diem money and going back to their workplaces accomplishing nothing.
There are a number of people that the veterans would like to see on the Hall of Shame. General Franks, Secretary of Defense William Cohen, Secretary of Defense William Perry, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, General Shelley Kashvili, General Schwarzkopf, General Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, Secretary of Defense John Deutsch, Dr. Michael Kilpatrick, Dr. Winkenwerder, Dr. Stephen Joseph, who was really the first to be involved in the PTSD cover-up, Dr. Joyce Lashoff, who chaired the Presidential Advisory Commission, Lieutenant Colonel Vicki Merriman, Michael Fomento. He wasn't in the government, but he acted almost with them. He wrote Gulf War Syndrome. And I have to tell you, that is probably the hardest thing that ever happened for a Gulf War veteran, was to read how they were just making up the Gulf War illness. Michael Fomento did a tremendous disservice to the military, put more people, I think, on the verge of suicide than anyone ever did in that one article in Reason magazine.
We have attempted to get members within each administration to act, and we have failed. We have only a handful of members of Congress that have done anything to attempt to help us. Christopher Shays, Bernard Sanders, Jim McDermott, Dennis Kucinich. We only have a handful.
In Congress, you've had your chance. Congressman McDermott gave you chances. Other congressmen tried to get bills on depleted uranium. They may have gotten 9 or 12 people to sign up on them, and nothing got into law except study it. That was by amendment, folded into another bill and hidden.
They've been briefed, they have read the material, they're aware of the casualties, and they abandon the American warrior in a time of need. That's inexcusable. They have to remember, we don't work for them, they work for us. And they must be held accountable. All the way up to the President of the United States must fulfill his obligation to provide medical care to all of us, to clean up the environment, but more important, they all must be held accountable because they allowed these wars to continue. Inexcusable. And they must be held accountable.
So we had to go to the states, Connecticut, Louisiana, New York, California, and we're trying to get them to enact laws in their state so at least their National Guard that the state has control over will test those troops the appropriate way and getting money from the state to have that testing done. This is wrong.
Representative Jack Metcalf was very interested in the subject, and he knew very well what was happening. I was told by his people who came to the meeting, Joyce, the representative knows that you're telling the truth, but he can't publicly support you, was the statement they gave to me. I said, I'm not concerned about supporting me. That's not the issue. I'm concerned about him doing something for the military.
I sent those soldiers to the Persian Gulf. I voted to confront Saddam Hussein, get him out of Kuwait, not allow him to control nearly 50% of the world's oil, and amass an incredible military machine. I felt very right then when I voted to send our troops there, and I feel right now. But I have this aching heart that the soldiers I sent were not treated properly in terms of their potential exposure, and clearly not treated properly once they came home. And I have a hard time living with that.
I served proudly. I felt I was serving my country. I felt I was defending my country. I would fight for the American people. I would fight for the human rights. I would fight for freedom, but knowing what the Department of Defense has done to us, I wouldn't fight for the Department of Defense.
I used to go into Dr. Kilpatrick's office within the Department of Defense, and I would sit down and try to pick his brain and ask him, why do you feel that veterans are complaining? And he would say, because they want money.
They're lost in the system at the VA, fighting to get some little money to help them keep living. They can't work. They end up getting sicker. Their marriages take a hit. And they end up divorced. They end up homeless. And they're dying.
The Army provides great medical benefits for you and your family. I know that I can go to sick hall, or I can go to the doctor. Any kind of appointment that you would want to make on the civilian side, you can do that in the Army.
For all individuals that have been discharged from the Department of Defense, either in the U.S. Army Reserve, the National Guard, or in the active duty, over 205,000 as of Thanksgiving of 2006 have now gone to the VA as DNBI casualties seeking medical care, disease and non-battle injury. We're looking at 30 to 40% of all individuals becoming very ill and very sick.
There's no doubt that right now that the Gulf Wars collectively have killed half as many troops as were killed in Vietnam. I mean, we have right now on the doorsteps of the VA people begging to get in, begging for help, being turned away, suffering, and then committing suicide. We're seeing illnesses much faster at a much greater rate. Since we know that we've probably deployed 1.3 million troops already to Iraq, we're going to have a figure that is so high, so off the charts, nobody's going to believe how many will be returning ill and how sick they will be from Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom.
There's been bills introduced lately in the last session of Congress and this session, setting up the same path, a registry of veterans, a registry to document who served where and when they enter the medical system. They're starting on that path one that we took 16 years ago, and we still haven't gotten the right diagnosis and treatment.
We know very well that all of our soldiers, Marines, Air Force men, Navy people go there to expose their life to the risk of actual battles, to the risk of being killed by the bullets and the roadside bombs. In addition to it, we are dealing with invisible enemy, which is suspended radiation in the air, which really our soldiers do not deserve to be additionally exposed to, and much less than the soldiers, civilians and children have even less culpability because they really don't know what they're dealing with.
You train an individual to go into service, how to fire a rifle, how to do his job. But you don't spend 5 minutes deprogramming when he comes out, when he has problems. How do you expect to get an all-volunteer army if you don't take care of the veterans that are coming out?
I think a lot of veterans are angry because when you join the military, all of us have different reasons why we did it. But I think for most people, there's a covenant, there's a belief that you're doing something noble. And you're making a sacrifice not only for your country, but for your family, and you're willing to risk life and limb. And when you make that bond, when you raise your right hand and you swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, you make a bond with your government that you're willing to risk your limbs and your brain and your well-being to go sacrifice. And the unspoken commitment that every soldier believes, and I know I believed it, and I know every other soldier believed it, is that if you are injured, whether it be from a bullet, a bomb, a chemical warfare agent, a biological weapons release, a psychological injury, that your government will take care of you when you come home. And they will give you everything that they can to bring you back to that place that you were before you went to war and sustained that injury. But what you find out is your war's over. The next war's begun. We have to talk about the new veterans.
When the Washington Post reported a front-page story about the neglect and abuse of soldiers returning injured at Walter Reed Army Hospital, that was a tragedy. What about the 400,000 soldiers who are not being treated at Walter Reed, who are being neglected because no one is acknowledging that their illnesses are real? Instead, they're calling it post-traumatic stress disorder. It is my hope that the editors of the Washington Post will spend the same amount of time and diligence investigating the claims of 400,000 very sick Gulf War veterans that did not make it into Walter Reed Army Hospital. And yet, they are being neglected, and they are suffering, and they are dying at very high numbers. It seems that no one has paid attention to their plight yet. When virtually all members of Congress say, yes, we support our soldiers, even if they may not support this war, many people I've interviewed say, not true. We went over, we fought, we did the best we could, and now we're sick, we're in pain, we have real illnesses. Where are these same legislators? Where are these presidential candidates? They're not there protecting us. They're not passing laws that will help us in our plight. They talk, but they don't act. From multiple sclerosis to chronic fatigue syndrome, from fibromyalgia to gastrointestinal disturbances, these soldiers are toxic, and yet no one is helping them. Why doesn't the Washington Post interview them? Why aren't they on front-page stories? If a couple of thousand soldiers returning through Walter Reed are abused, what about the hundreds of thousands, they say, who have been given no attention whatsoever, no support from anyone? Their stories deserve attention also.
the ideal situation is that there's international agreement to outlaw the use of uranium weapons. Not depleted uranium weapons, uranium weapons. Outlaw the use of uranium weapons. That's what must happen. It must happen at the highest level.
You need to hear the truth, and you're not going to hear it from congressmen, senators, your president, or your presidential candidates. You need to listen to your troops that lived through the battle. I experienced it myself. I've gone through trying to get the diagnostic testing for myself, getting it from outside. Only a handful of us have been able to do that through benefactors, to get some real testing done, real diagnostic work, to show the effect on our own body. And then we turn around and try to fight to get those same tests done for others. 16 years, no treatment.
Well, I think the best approach to solving this problem now is to acknowledge that the problem exists, to stop saying that this is all a psychological problem, like post-traumatic stress disorder, and to realize that many, if not the overwhelming majority of these veterans that are suffering with real medical reasons for their ailments, and to set up some kind of a systematic way to examine these veterans to determine what their exposures were, what types of toxic materials are still present in their bodies, whether these be biological, radiological, or chemical, and treat them.
They have no fight left in them. It's now time that we take that fight and that we go forward, unfortunately in the memory of a lot of those troops.
So now you ask, what can we do? Well, we can become proactive. The first step in fighting these wrongs is awareness. Now the job, I believe, is up to all of us to make others aware. We should immediately stop denying that Gulf War syndrome is merely post-traumatic stress disorder. Every single person who has any symptoms should be helped at no charge, so it is no longer financially burdening to them. Every Iraqi child who's been adversely affected by depleted uranium should be treated as assertively and positively as possible. Network, contact government officials, the media, state representatives, become a voice for the voiceless. We should also ask for open hearings, a truth committee where individuals who participated in the cover-up are allowed to come forward, acknowledge their culpability, tell the truth, and be given immunity, and let the public know what exactly happened. Who was responsible? It's time to stop this massive cover-up. In order for this to happen, we must all become involved. No more stacked hearings. Let real people come forward and tell the truth. Only then can we have served our troops as they have so bravely served us.